Welcome back, everyone, to another edition of the Prove Me Wrong podcast. I'm your host, Pete Lieb. I'm glad you're all on board with me today. I have another great show lined up today. We've been getting very lucky. We are going to talk Bigfoot, maybe the undisputed hide-and-seek champion of all time. And to do that, I'm very fortunate to have cryptozoologist and field investigator Ken Gerhard with us today. I hope I said your last name correctly. Ken has been a fixture on the History, Travel, National Geographic channels, among others, as well as an author of the brand new book, The Essential Guide to Bigfoot, and several other books on beasts and monsters of all kinds, things that I'm incredibly interested in. Werewolves, Mothman, you name it. You can also find Ken on his website, kengerhard.com. But today, again, we're going to talk Bigfoot. Mothman's for a different discussion. So welcome, Ken, to Prove Me Wrong podcast.
Well, good evening, Pete. Thank you so much for having me on. And yeah, you were close. It's actually Gerhard.
Gerhard.
But a lot of people have difficulty with the pronunciation, so please don't feel bad.
Well, I apologize for that. I know I have a 4-letter last name, but people get it wrong almost every time. So I apologize.
No worries.
So my first question then is just for all the uninitiated out there, and maybe even me a little bit, what exactly does cryptozoology mean?
The word cryptozoology is derived from the Latin words crypto, meaning hidden, and, of course, zoology pertains to the study of animals. Mm-hmm. So essentially, the study of hidden animals is the direct translation. And to clarify that, of course, there are new animal species that are still being discovered on a regular basis. It would surprise a lot of people to know that as many as 5,000 new species are described every year. Now, the vast majority of those, of course, are insects and corals and things like that. Mm-hmm. But every year there's a surprising number of mammals and reptiles and birds and things that turn up. And so the premise is that we're looking for animals that haven't been discovered yet. And cryptozoologists tend to focus on the more, shall we say, romantic or legendary animals, things like Bigfoot and the Loch Ness Monster, the Chupacabra, and there's a whole wealth of things that people haven't heard of that we investigate as well, mystery cats and Tasmanian tigers and so on and so forth. The reason that, scientists, of course, discover most of the new species, mm-hmm. rightfully so, but the reason scientists don't become involved in cryptozoology is because a lot of times their jobs or careers are based on their reputations and grants and things like that, and to become involved with something like as highly controversial as Bigfoot or the Loch Ness Monster is tantamount to career suicide for a lot of scientists. So it kind of opens the door for laymen such as myself. I don't have an academic degree. My father was a scientist. I'm just a science lover, a citizen scientist. But so essentially I go out and look for evidence or proof that some of these things might actually exist.
And how did you get started as a field researcher? Was there an experience that you had that led you down this path?
Well, it was kind of looking back on my life now, Pete. There was a whole bunch of synchronicities and sort of impactful moments. But I always tell people that as a young boy, I was already fascinated with animals and monsters, and I had pet alligators, and I loved Godzilla movies and all, the whole shebang. So mm-hmm. It was already. So when I found out about Bigfoot when I was about 10 years old, I saw a TV show, and it just like something clicked. And what was really important though is that my mother was a travel agent, very adventurous person, and she used to enthrall me with stories of the Yeti and the Mothman and all of these fabulous creatures. But she loved to travel, so I got to travel with her all over the world to 26 different countries on every continent except Antarctica. And by age 15, I was at Loch Ness in Scotland. And as a young man, I was trying to do field research. I had a movie camera, and I was interviewing people, and so it's just been kind of a lifelong passion. I just feel very blessed to have had the opportunity to investigate some of these mysteries.
What does a hunt consist of today for you? How does a hunt get started? And kind of give me the rundown.
Well, it's different for different situations because, I'm a fairly broad in terms of what I investigate. I, of course, investigated the Bigfoot mystery for 4 decades, mm-hmm. pretty passionately, done lake monsters, thunderbirds, big flying creatures that people have reported reported, not as well known, but I've investigated many of those. So just based on what I'm investigating, I have to look at the situation. I'm not at liberty. I'm kind of self-funded, Pete, so I'm not at liberty to just fly around the country right now whenever anyone calls and say, hey, come check out this Bigfoot sighting that happened last week. So I have to kind of pick and choose my opportunities. So, I do get a lot of people reach out to me that have had sightings or think that they've seen some of these creatures. I'll interview them. If they're very compelling and credible, I'll usually have multiple interviews, and then eventually I'll make plans to go to a particular location and do an investigation. Or I have other colleagues, investigators, that will invite me on their expeditions.
How do you determine
TV shows?
No doubt. And I was going to ask you, how did you
and the
determine,
TV companies?
How did you determine? I was going to ask you how you determined how someone was credible. I know that's really what I was going to. You kind of led into that a little bit. So are you expecting them to give you some type of evidence, or is it just they have a compelling story and you interview them a couple times and the story doesn't change too much, so you feel like it's worth it?
Yeah. So good question. Cryptozoology encompasses a lot of different disciplines. So in addition to knowing about zoology and anthropology and stuff, you also have to know a lot about folklore and mythology, linguistics. And in terms of investigating eyewitnesses, we've kind of learned how to become sort of amateur psychologists and also employ interrogation methods that are used in law enforcement and stuff. People basically, they send messages, and we have to acknowledge, Pete, that all people have biases.
Right.
Whether conscious or unconscious, people have biases, and they'll act in certain ways that are determined by their biases. So you have to kind of take it on an individual basis. But for example, if someone's story is just right out the bat is just so sensational that there are details that are just hard for me to wrap my head around, like, a lot of times those have to be dismissed out of hand because, you're already talking about a Bigfoot. Now, if you told me that you saw a Bigfoot and he was standing next to Dogman, which is another creature entirely, that immediately lowers the credibility because it just, the odds of that happening just seem incomprehensible. A lot of times I'm excited when people reach out to me and preface their story by saying, Ken, I've never had any interest in the unexplained. I don't care about the Bigfoot, but this is what happened. This is what I saw. That's important because they're kind of giving me they're letting me know that they had no bias coming into this, that they saw something they just couldn't explain and they need to talk to somebody about it. On the other hand, if someone tells me, I grew up my whole life, I love Bigfoot and ghosts and UFOs and all that, and now I've seen Bigfoot and I've also seen a UFO, and and not to sound unkind, Pete, but again, this is very serious business in terms of trying to get to the truth. And so there are a lot of storytellers, and a lot of times I'll interview people multiple times, and one of my techniques is I'll interview someone initially, and then I'll call them back randomly, maybe a few weeks later, just out of the blue, and I'll ask them a lot of the same questions, pretend like I misplaced my notes, and what did you say about this and that, and then I'll, if the stories remain consistent over several tellings, that's important, when people tend to change the story as it goes along, that again becomes, so, a lot of this is just kind of common sense.
Right.
But extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. I didn't create that saying. It's an awesome saying.
It's a good one.
The bottom line. So
are there specific hot spots throughout this country where where the predominance of sightings occur?
Yeah, there are. It's interesting, and I have a number of my entire wall, or all the walls of my home, are wallpapered with maps, and they're specific to different cryptids. Cryptid is the word we use to describe the subjects that we investigate in cryptozoology. So, for example, I've got a thunderbird map on my wall, and all these thunderbirds, which again are like giant, what people describe as giant birds with 15 to 20 foot wingspans, far beyond anything that's recognized by modern science. And I've got the map, and you can actually see patterns. They almost look like migration routes once you start, tacking in all of the sightings that people have given me through the years. And I've even had friends come over that look at the map and say, "Holy crap, man! You can see clusters here, And it's like, well, yeah, there do seem to be clusters of certain types of cryptids in different locations, and often those locations are habitats that are suitable for that alleged cryptid. For example, we have a lot more sightings of Bigfoot in the Pacific Northwest, in the mountains, the Cascade Mountains and the Rockies and some of these remote areas, and not so many in the middle of Kansas, out in the cornfields. So, I mean, it's all speculation, but that, to me, that's compelling. If you have a habitat that's suitable for that thing.
So, in all of your hunts, what's kind of some of the most compelling evidence that you've found to date for Bigfoot specifically?
Well, I've never seen one, and that's why I tell people I'm only 90% convinced they exist. But I've spoken to so many people who have. But I have had I've heard vocalizations. I'm very convinced I've heard vocalizations that could not be attributed to any other North American species other than a large primate. But one occasion in particular, on August 18th, 2003, at a place called Cottonwood Lake in North Texas, I was with 3 other investigators at a location we'd been alerted to. There was a lot of activity going on. Right as soon as the sun went down, we heard deep grunting noises. It sounded just like a large ape, like a gorilla or some type of primate, coming out of the brush, very loud and powerful, really shook us because we all immediately recognized it was nothing that we'd ever heard before. I recorded them. I still have a recording of them. We couldn't see what was actually making them because the brush was so thick, and it was honestly, it sounded very aggressive and big, so we were reticent to just cut through there. We went to a higher vantage point and shined a spotlight down, and we did get some eye shine coming back at us. It wasn't red eye shine. It was kind of a yellowish green color. It seemed to be high off the ground. It was hard to tell, but then the following morning, we camped out there. The following morning, we finally made our way through the brush in daylight. And the thing, whatever had made the noises, was gone, obviously. But we did find on a little beach there some deep, very, very deep footprints, human-shaped footprints, and also a number of turtle shells, very good-sized turtle shells that had been ripped in half from top to bottom, torn like a piece of paper, and thrown into a pile. And so I immediately recognized that, having owned many turtles in my life, that nothing could rip a turtle shell in half like that, So that was the most convincing thing, all of that happening together, the synthesis of that evening and that following morning was the most convincing thing I've experienced. And obviously it's far from convincing to most people that are skeptical about Bigfoot. It's just an account or a story, but I do have a recording of the sounds and pictures of the turtle shells and so on and so forth. So.
I was going to ask you about that because there's been a recent a video from, I think it was Kentucky. It might be someplace like that was just kind of went viral. It was sweeping the country, and it was a lot of those same kind of howling noises. And the guy was talking to his wife and told her to get back in the house. Do you remember that video?
Yeah, I think it was from Canada, actually.
It could have been for sure. He seemed to have a southern accent to me. But what did you make of that video? When you hear things like that, are you able to kind of immediately say, well, that's a mountain lion, or what did you think? It was
unusual because of the frequency of the sounds. I mean, whatever was making the noises was just kind of going off. But and it was hard to tell because it was very distant and there was an echo and so on and so forth. But my gut instinct is that it was probably a large wolf. It sounded to me more canid than primate. So it was like a wolf kind of. But it was interesting in terms of how much it was vocalizing and how loud it was projecting. So, we have to accept, Pete, that on occasion every animal is capable of demonstrating behaviors or doing things that are unusual and uncommon. And a lot of times when people experience those things, they interpret them, if they don't understand exactly what's going on, if they hear a noise or find some sign or something that's unusual, they may interpret that as being something completely unknown. But, we can't ever rule that out, that sometimes they're just like extraordinary behaviors that are being demonstrated by an animal under a weird circumstance or something.
Do you receive a lot of evidence? Do people send you a lot of things in terms of pictures or video? Do you receive that at your headquarters there?
I get a lot of, everyone sends me a lot of videos and photos. What do you think of this and that? And if there's something, like you said, those sounds, if there's something that's really hot on social media, then a bunch of people will send it to me.
Because
I'm kind of down.
Well, just because my question was just also because how do you determine what's real and what's faked? I mean, that's kind of where I was going to go with that question. Was everything nowadays with Photoshop and with all those video editors, it used to be much easier to kind of tell what was real than it is now. How do you what do you go through to tell? Oh, that's faked. Oh, that's photoshopped. What steps do you go through?
Well, it's exactly what I was going to segue into.
Yeah.
You kind of read my mind, but I've almost come to a determination that photographic and video evidence, no matter how good it may seem, is just not even worth consideration anymore.
Right.
Because if it looks too good, then you're going to think, oh, this was really well done, And if it looks too bad, then obviously it's just a bad attempt at faking. So it's just, there's no way to prove 100% the validity of photographic evidence in our day and age with all the technology that's available to people. I've seen some amazing fakeries, hoaxes and fabrications and things done by even friends of mine that are good with graphics and photographs and stuff. So I know people like to get excited about photographs and videos. There's something stimulating about that visual stimuli, at that moment of something weird and unusual. But, going into context of like the Patterson-Gimlin film, now that's interesting because that was made back in 1967 when costumes and technology were not that good. So, I mean, that's why a lot of Bigfoot investigators are very soundly behind that piece of footage, because it would have been much, much harder, almost impossible in my mind to have faked that back in 67. So you're right. Now, one last thing I want to add to that, Pete, is that in terms of eyewitness sightings, reports, which I realize are just anecdotes, but they were much more credible back in the day as well, because a lot of the famous cases, for example, in the Bigfoot field, Mothman and so forth, people actually went to the police and reported that they saw a Bigfoot or a Mothman or some other creature. So now they're testifying before law enforcement, which I imagine is against the law if you're sitting there telling a cop, making up a story. And then they would subsequently, their names would end up in the newspaper. So now they're being ridiculed by all of their friends and neighbors, and they're standing behind, I know what I saw, So that to me is very credible, that someone's willing to risk their reputation, possible legal ramifications to go out and say they saw Bigfoot, as opposed to nowadays, people just go onto websites and they post anonymously, or they've got a tag name or something. And it's like, unfortunately, you can't put a lot of credibility into those sightings, because it could just be someone making up a story, and there's no way to test that.
Well, then it comes to just the increased bandwidth that you get with the internet and with social media. You went to the cops back in the day because there was nobody else to tell. Everything was very localized.
Well, that's a good point. So I can't argue with that logic as well. You're right. There was no other outlet back in the day. I guess you could call someone on the landline,
right? But the
rotary phone.
There just wasn't anything there. Now with you can reach the entire world with one Facebook post or one Instagram post. Everybody will see it. So you don't have to go and you won't have your small little town looking at you like you're crazy. You'll probably have millions of people around the world believing everything you say. So you can get that instant gratification too of belief that you would not have gotten.
Yeah, that's great points, and I guess it's a double-edged sword, because there are benefits in terms of the databases of sightings and ways to get in touch with people and stuff. So you're right.
So you feel like the Patterson film is still the gold standard, yeah?
Oh, yeah. And I mean, in fact, if you look at it now, because, talking about all this great technology, there have been in recent years some really impressive, there's been some impressive work done on the film in terms of, digitizing the film and then enhancing it, stabilizing it and all that. And if you look at some of the newest work that's been done on that, the stabilizations and stuff on a high-res, big screen television set, blown up, I mean, to me, it looks more real now than it ever has. I mean, you can really see a lot of detail in terms of the muscle masses moving and skin folds, and there's what appears to be a herniation on the quadricep, the right quadricep, that's bouncing up and down, the breasts, the way the breasts bounce. I mean, I just did not see how someone could have faked that costume back in 1967. And even apparently John Green, great Bigfoot investigator, even went to Disney Studios with a copy of the film back then. And Disney Studios, which was, the state of the art back in 67, said, yeah, we wouldn't be able to do that. So all these people want to say that Roger Patterson, a kind of down on his luck, rodeo cowboy from Yakima, Washington, pulled off this amazing Bigfoot recreation that still has fooled people for 50 years. I don't know. I'm solidly behind the film. Plus I know Bob Gimlin, who was there. I've known him for 50 years, and he's as credible as a person as you'll meet. He swears it was real. What they saw was a creature. So yeah, it's the gold standard. I don't think it'll ever be matched.
How come? So I'm going to start asking you questions like the skeptic. So now I'm going to say, how come we've never found a carcass or a body or a physical remnant that we can carry back in outside of a footprint and say, here it is? Have we found something like that? Have there been skulls found or long bones found?
No, there's been no hard physical evidence in terms of bones, body, DNA. Now, you're right. While on the face of it does seem like a highly unlikely proposition, there are reasons for this. Mm-hmm. And the first thing I point out to people is that Bigfoot is exceptionally rare. We're talking about a very rare animal. There may be as many as 1,000 bears for every single Bigfoot and this is based, again, it's all speculation, but based on the known ranges of certain individual Bigfoots who have very consistent footprints and things like that, we've been able to determine or guess that there's probably about 4,000, maybe lower, but, maybe 4,000 or a few thousand Bigfoot spread across North America. Think about that, spread all across North America, from Alaska to Canada to Washington. That's still a few thousand. That's spread pretty darn thin. They're very rare animals.
How do we come up with that number? How do we determine that there were a couple? If we haven't seen them and we haven't found bodies, how do we know there's only a couple thousand?
Well, if there's any less than that, they would go extinct because they wouldn't have enough genetic viability. So there would have to be at least a couple thousand, or 1,000, 1,500. Even at that amount, they're critically endangered. So if they exist, if we go in saying, like me, I'm 90% convinced they exist. I've weighed all the evidence, so there have to be at least a couple thousand. Now, a few thousand was based on an equation I worked out with Dr. Jeff Meldrum, who's a physical anthropologist at Idaho State, who's very active in the Bigfoot field. Okay, so he told me that he knew of a specific Bigfoot individual based on the morphology of a certain footprint that had a wide range of about 60 miles from here to there, point A to B, or in other words, 1,000 square miles. And you can look at other primates like gorillas and orangutans to look at their model of how much range and habitat male orangutans will have a certain range. That's their territory and so on and so forth. So we're borrowing from other perhaps similar hominids or hominoids. Okay, so 1,000 square miles. Now, if you extrapolate that across North America, looking at just the wilderness areas, not the cities and the developed suburbs, but just wilderness areas being defined as places where people don't live, right? Mountain ranges, swamps, forests. It comes to about 4,000. And that exact number, in fact, was first estimated by another physical anthropologist named Dr. Grover Krantz at Washington State University, who is a very smart guy that looked at the Bigfoot evidence for many years. And again, it's just based on, the premise that if there were more than that, then they'd be discovered by now. We'd find them more often. If they were less than that, then they would begin to have issues in terms of genetic viability and variation, and they would go extinct. Oh. So it's just a guess, but, it's right now it's the best we have. So, so they're very rare. The next thing to keep in mind is that, in my own opinion at least, they're very intelligent. I'm not saying they're as smart as humans, but they are very intelligent, probably more so than any other animal. And this is the important thing, Pete. In my opinion, Bigfoot has adapted specific behavior patterns, I call them avoidance behaviors, specifically to avoid humans. They recognize that we are their greatest threat and that we could potentially drive them to extinction. We're in direct competition, okay? So if they're built to avoid us, then they're going to live in the places that we don't go, the wilderness. They appear to be nocturnal, largely nocturnal, moving around mostly at night when we're not active. Again, mostly not in the woods. And they also appear to be very nomadic, and they move around a lot. So these are all seem like strategies to avoid being found. So that's the second thing. And the last thing I want to say is that, and kind of tying into that, there are some researchers that think that they may actually bury their own dead. I mean, that's speculation. But this is important. Most alpha predators in the wild, whether they're bears or mountain lions or coyotes, those animals typically you don't find their remains in the woods. Why not? Because when they're sick or think they may be about to die, and they're typically not hunted or hit by cars as often. So when they think they're going to die or they're sick, they'll hide their bodies. They crawl into low brush or into a hidden area to hide while they either recover or oftentimes they expire. So if a bear is crawling into the brush and its body is hidden and it dies, then it certainly lessens the chances that you're going to find that particular remains of that animal. And bearing that out, it's a well-known fact by outdoorsmen that it's very, very rare that you do find bear remains in the woods. You find a host of other animals in the woods, deer, raccoons, pigs, goat remains. You almost never find a bear's remains because they are apex predators. They hide their bodies when they're ailing. And if there's 1,000 bears to every Bigfoot, think about that.
Yeah, that was one of my questions because I couldn't imagine that a Bigfoot has a predator. And typically a predator is what keeps the population control in check. Right? Most animals have a predator of some type, and that controls the population. We don't have a predator really, and our population has exploded. So that was kind of why I was wondering, how do we know there are 4,000? Because it seems to me like there's a lot of space out there. There's a lot of space in that Pacific Northwest, a lot of space up in New England there, and in Canada, places to hide. No real predators. There could be more than that. That was kind of where I was going with it. And
you're right. No, I'm trying to be conservative. That's what the way I'm trying to, because I'm trying to sell Bigfoot to people. Look, only 18 to 20% of the population thinks that Bigfoot could possibly exist. 80 to 82% of the population, the general population, does not think that Bigfoot could possibly exist, and I understand why. So I'm trying to sell it, if you will, to those people to at least consider. Okay, I know it sounds highly improbable, ridiculous, but it could be true. These things could, again, a lot of it has to go with their adaptation and ability to avoid being found by us, and also the fact that they're so incredibly rare, elusive, intelligent, nocturnal, nomadic. That's a good design to avoid being found by humans.
So if they want to avoid being found and they're smart enough to do so, why when we have these sightings, it's typically that they're throwing rocks or they're knocking things, trying to scare us away. Why not just avoid us?
Well, that's a good point. It'd be anthropomorphic thinking for me to project why a Bigfoot is going to do this or that, even though I just tried to build a case for its behavior patterns. What I could say is that maybe they have particular spots that are kind of like their home bases or, where their family, Say, for example, Bigfoot is a social animal like most primates, and it has a family unit. A female, there's a male, maybe a couple of females and babies or whatever. And for whatever reason, they're not mobilized, and two hunters just happen to stumble in one morning into their area and surprise them. Maybe instead of mobilizing, if they're kind of camped out there and they're, that's where the food source is at that time, then they might have kind of an immediate and defensive reaction and start throwing rocks, which is a typical primate reaction. Chimps do it, humans do it. Apes throw rocks when they're mangry and trying to, it's a territorial display. So that may be part of it. The wood knocks, there's a lot of speculation about why they make these knocking noises. Most of it goes back to the fact that this may be a way that they're communicating with each other, somehow like locating each other in the woods or something. But, there are typically most eyewitness sightings. I mean, again, going back to the Patterson-Gimlin film, Pete, two guys on horseback ride up and surprise this Bigfoot that's squatted down by a creek. What does it do? It gets up in the film. It gets up and walks away as quickly as it can. It looks back over its shoulder one time when Giblin gets off his horse and pulls a gun out. And most of the accounts, I mean, you're right. There are some. The rock throwing is a common thing. I mean, I do hear that a lot about rocks flying out of the wilderness at people. If you're trying to consider yourself, that doesn't seem like a good strategy.
Right. At that point, if you're throwing rocks, why not just come right out and show yourself and just scream and scare the hell out of them? They won't come back at that point. If I see an 8-footer come out.
I didn't say that. I said, I don't think they're intelligent as people. They're probably as intelligent as a lot of animals, which can have a lot of intelligence. But we don't know. I mean, you make some good points. The one thing that I'm very skeptical about are these habituation claims where people say that they have Bigfoot, that they're communicating with Bigfoot, that the Bigfoot's visiting them and leaving them gifts and this and that. That obviously contradicts my theory and my hypothesis, so I don't, and I honestly think if that was a common thing, that we would also have evidence by now definitive evidence that they actually existed if they would come and if they went and visited people's farms and things like that.
And that's when you get into the credibility of the people again. You start getting in and talking to people who either they're looking for attention or maybe they're just not in touch with reality, and that really hurts. People who are trying to put some real scientific exploration there or real scientific evidence there. You'll have people, like you said, Bigfoot comes to me at night and, sings me sonnets. And it's just so ridiculous. Then the entire object of hunting for Bigfoot or the entire idea of believing in it becomes ridiculous because of the fringe.
Yeah, but, and I do have a lot of interactions with these types of people, Pete, and not to be unkind, but, you're right. There seems to be a certain narcissistic type of delusion when someone can convince themselves of all the 8 billion people on the planet, I'm the one that Bigfoot has chosen to communicate with, But I've run into a lot of those cases where people have tried to convince me to come to their property. They are getting regular, they have definitive proof Bigfoot exists. They can basically call them out and communicate with them. And I, reluctantly, I guess, I never have actually been convinced to go out to any of these locations because usually the people's, oftentimes the behavior of the people is curious as well. So, but it's a recurring thing. It's a thing. There are many people that claim, and I can't definitively say that they're not having these experiences, but I'm skeptical. They claim these Bigfoot creatures come and interact with them. But you just can't dispel the fact that there are so many psychological and sociological components that could tie into that,
So do you have any, some of the best or better stories that you've received, or some of the things that you've gone out and studied? Can you kind of share a couple of stories of sightings or circumstances that were really compelling?
Some of them are, in my new book, I have actually a chapter dedicated to some of the more compelling sightings. But to me, Pete, the most convincing and compelling sightings are the ones where you have multiple eyewitnesses, right? Because if you have one person come out of the woods and say they saw Bigfoot, that's interesting. But then 2 or 3 or 4 come out and say they all saw Bigfoot. And, in cases like that, you obviously have corroboration. So those are always kind of cool in my mind. One that is well regarded in the Bigfoot field is known as the Crandall Campground. Sorry, that's a tongue twister. Crandall Campground incident. This is from southwest Alberta, Canada, in a place called Waterton National Park. And there were 2 couples that were camping out there back in 1988. And they were playing cards one night at a picnic table, and they decided to get up and get ready for bed. And basically, they heard something moving along the trail to their campground, and they saw the silhouette. They knew it was huge, so they thought it was a bear at first. So they all jumped in their cars and turned on their headlights, which were aimed at this thing. And they all 4 people claim they saw this thing walking on its hind legs like a human with long arms, swinging shoulders, and a flat face. And they say it was about 8 feet tall, and it took some strides up an embankment. And they were all convinced that there was no way this was a bear. It was walking just like a human. Again, had long swinging arms, human-like stride, no snout. So they basically reported it to a local camp rangers, and of course the camp rangers tried to convince them it was a bear. But ultimately they were interviewed separately by a well-known Canadian Bigfoot investigator named Thomas Steenberg, and he did an in-depth investigation and interviewed them all separately, and very consistent and very convincing. So, I mean, that's a good example of a kind of a, credible sighting. You have multiple witnesses. There's no embellishments. It didn't do anything sensational. It was just, they caught it. It walked up a hill, and, there are certain features you just can't equate to any known animal. There's nothing that stands 8 feet tall that has long swinging arms and, that's hair covered. So, another one, a friend of mine, a guy named Todd Neese, was a sergeant in the Army, a demolitions expert back in '93 up in Oregon at a place called Saddle Mountain. And they were doing some work, doing some demolitions at these different rock quarries, testing explosives. And as they were driving up in a Humvee, he looked down a hill and saw 3 8-foot-tall man-like creatures kind of standing next to each other where they had just come from, where there had been this explosion or demolition earlier in the day. And they were rocking back and forth and swinging their arms. And he didn't want to say anything, because he's in the Army, I guess. And when they got to their location, he got out of the Humvee, and another sergeant who was in the vehicle came up to him and said, "Did you see that?" And they basically kind of had to feel each other out. Like, what did you see? What did you see? And they both finally agreed that they saw Bigfoot. I mean, there was no other explanation that they saw these 3 Bigfoot. So that's kind of, and actually that was so impactful on Todd that he ultimately became a respected Bigfoot investigator. He's up in Oregon, and he's devoted his life to it. So very profound. So that shows me something too, that you have this kind of profound impact on somebody.
So is there, are we surmising that these animals are vegetarian in respect? They're not meat eating. They're not hunters. They're just gathering what's around.
In my book, I talk about diet, and what I say is that Bigfoot is a generalist omnivore, which is exactly what you would say about a bear. There are accounts of Bigfoot eating leaves, roots, berries, grasses, nuts, mollusks, fish, insects, small animals like rodents, deer, elk, even carrion. So, and I've seen evidence that they eat turtles and oysters here in Texas, Louisiana. So that makes sense from a biological perspective because they're very large animals.
Right. That's where I was going with it.
Presumably weigh 500 to 1,000 pounds, high metabolism, very active. So they have to eat a lot of stuff. So they would eat pretty much everything that they can eat, from plant matter to small animals to scavenging or whatever. There have even been sightings of them rooting around garbage dumpsters and grease traps and things like that. So very similar to a bear. And I think that they, in fact, fill or did fill in the past, maybe when their numbers were greater, the same ecological niche that bears fill in North America, just these big omnivores running around and eating everything in sight in the woods.
So we have stories of a Bigfoot creature, quote unquote, finger quotes, all over the world. Do you equate them all together? Do you think that is a Yeti the same as a Bigfoot, is the same as a skunk ape, is the same as a Sasquatch? Are they all the same thing, just with different regional names to you?
Well, that's a great question. Looking at the evidence and the descriptions and, on an individual basis, you would have to speculate that there were at least 2 and perhaps as many as 4 different subspecies of things that are called Bigfoot. In my new book, I dedicate a chapter to something called Littlefoot, which is basically a pygmy or a dwarf-sized version of Bigfoot from about 3 to 4 to 5 feet tall that's been reported all over the world. And in fact, the Yeti, which you just mentioned, most people don't know this, but the Yeti of the Himalayas is typically described as being only about 4 feet tall. It's a very small, even though it looks like Bigfoot, it's a kind of a squat version of Bigfoot. You also have something called the orang tendek, or short man of Sumatra. And there are many Native American legends, in fact, about little people, and they're usually hairy little people that live in the woods. So I think there's at least 2 kinds. Now, Ivan Sanderson, who was one of the founders of cryptozoology, one of the founding fathers, speculated that there were 4 different types of mystery hominids in the planet. The big one, Bigfoot, Sasquatch, the giants. One that's a little bit smaller but more ape-like. And then one that's the pygmy version, which I just mentioned. And then maybe a 4th kind that's almost more like a Neanderthal type thing. It's got, wild men, as they call them. They're hairy, but they also have, loincloths and furs, and they use clubs and tools and, very primitive, human-like. So I think that was the original model, is 4 different subspecies of things that are called Bigfoots and Yetis and kind of lumped together. Since that time, it hasn't changed much. There are some cryptozoologists like Lauren Coleman have speculated there might be a few more types, and others like Grover Krantz said maybe there's only 1 or 2. So, but there are definitely different types. I mean, if you look at the descriptions, I mean they're grammatically different enough to speculate that there must be different types of things called Bigfoot or Yeti.
And that makes sense to me. I mean, there's scientific evidence that there were Neanderthals and Homo sapiens at the same time. I mean, there can definitely be things that are similar but different at the same time. So,
Pete, 50,000 years, just to your point real quick, 50,000, we now know because of discoveries in recent years, just 50,000 years ago, there was not only Homo sapiens and Homo sapiens neanderthalensis, but also Homo erectus, the Denisovans, Homo floresiensis, Homo luzonensis. So there is probably 5 or 6 different types of, hominin species that were all living about only 50,000 years ago. So that model has been proven now. Sure. So why not extend that into the modern day and say there could be multiple types of hominins still on the planet?
Absolutely. I mean, it makes sense. There are multiple types of cats. There are multiple types of, dog. There's still dog. But, I can totally get behind that. I have one more question here for you, and I'm going to go out in left field here for you, okay? I have heard theories. To me, they're not credible at all, but I'm going to let you convince me if you think this is the case. I've heard theories that the reason Bigfoot can't be found is that the Bigfoot creature is actually an interdimensional being, which is why they can't be found, because they don't actually live here. They cross a interdimensional portal, and essentially they're aliens. That to me is what makes real scientific evidence or review for these cryptids so difficult, because people take, well, we can't find them, so they have to be interdimensional. We have to just double down on the crazy, rather than say, they're just difficult to find. So have you heard that kind of thinking, that theory in the past?
Oh yeah, I deal with that all the time. That's a great conflict that's going on in the Bigfoot field, and there's actually a subculture that's developed of people that are very much into the paranormal Bigfoot stuff. It's very difficult. You're right. It kind of casts a dubious shadow across the entire field when people hear these theories. I'll say I can kind of understand, based on what we've talked about, how they're so difficult to find, why some people might jump to that conclusion. And I actually have a chapter in my new Bigfoot book dedicated to the sociology and psychology of Bigfoot and things like these subcultures. But, basically, it's just a problem of many humans being unable to separate different types of phenomenon into different categories and wanting to lump things together.
Right.
And that, ghosts, UFOs, Bigfoot, a lot of people, for whatever reason, there are some people that are just wired that way, and they want to interpret all of that as the same phenomenon, or different faces of the same phenomenon, or connect them somehow. Moreover, there are a lot of people that are, spiritualists and have sort of alternative views on the universe and physics and different things, and want to, link Bigfoot to religion and spirituality and the Bible and different things, and the Nephilim and all that. So, yeah, it's all about, everybody has a different perspective. And again, as we were saying earlier, everyone has a bias, inherent biases and, filters that they constantly wear when they view things. So, but, just so your listeners can rest assured, there is a core group of very scientific, very rational, logical, critically thinking Bigfoot investigators that are really trying to keep this on a scientific track and look for these things as if they are simply undiscovered relic hominids and not some type of interdimensional telepathic forest person, So, I mean, but it's a struggle because there are just a lot of people that view it that way, and
that's the key. That's the key to me because, like you, I can fully get behind. There is a lot of undiscovered land, a lot of undiscovered things in the oceans, a lot of things that we still don't know. We think we know everything. That's the real problem with humans right now. We think we know everything. There's nothing left to be discovered in the general population. So then when people are trying to find some of these things that could potentially still be out there, then you've got the fringe that just immediately, as soon as you start telling me that Bigfoot is interdimensional, you've lost me. Now I'm like, I can't get behind the whole thing because now you've thrown me into some type of crazy. And I don't want to be that way because I can completely get it that, at some point there was a land bridge between Alaska and Asia. Maybe these were apes that made that journey across that bridge, and they've evolved over time. There could be a lot of real scientific reasons for it, but as soon as you start throwing in that these things are traveling across dimensions, then it really has to hurt people like you who are trying to find scientific reasons. That's just my own editorial comment there. Sorry.
No, that was a beautiful take on it, and my mother raised me well, so I always try to be respectful of people's opinions and perspectives, and I try not to, but I have had some pretty heated, and unnecessarily heated exchanges with people when I question their beliefs, because a lot of people take it personally, like I'm attacking their religion almost, and it's like, look, you're entitled to have that perspective and that belief, but that is a recurring problem for me where in fact, I just got done with an email exchange a few minutes ago with a lady that, and she was entitled to her experiences, but, it was too far out for me.
Right.
I just couldn't buy in. So, tried not to offend her, but that does happen, unfortunately.
Well, thank you so much, Ken, once again for joining the show today. You provided me, just what I'm looking for here. So give me some scientific evidence. Give me some good responses to the questions that I had in terms of why haven't bodies been found? Why haven't we hit one with a car at this point? Why haven't we, unearthed one while we were the urban sprawl, right? Eventually we're going to be outside of those federally protected lands. We are industrializing a lot of space. And so to your point, they hide themselves and they find a cave. Eventually, maybe we'll find that cave too. And then we'll be able to see this, the remnants that we've been looking for. Would you like to spend another moment just to let the listeners know out there again how they can find you? I know that we've talked about your web page already, but do you want to promote anything else? Are you going to be seen somewhere soon? Is there, any other book that you have coming out brand new?
Well, thanks again for having me on, Pete.
Sure.
There was some great discussion and discourse, and you had some excellent points and great questions. So thanks for having me on. I really enjoyed it. I have a new book out. It's called The Essential Guide to Bigfoot.
Absolutely.
And if you like what you heard tonight, it's available on Amazon, or people can contact me directly if they want a signed copy. But basically, I'm trying to dispel a lot of the misperceptions and sort of paranormal things that have to do with Bigfoot, and just kind of put the science out there so that people can look at the kind of the consensus opinions of the people that have spent years and years trying to build a viable theory. So again, The Essential Guide to Bigfoot available on Amazon. People can also get in touch with me via my website, kengerhard.com. I'm on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. And as far as upcoming appearances, nothing really coming up this time of year, but next year, starting in the spring, I'll be touring around the country and giving presentations and talks at different Bigfoot conferences. Yep, that's a thing. There are
I'm sure of it.
There are some well-attended Bigfoot conferences around the country where we all get together and talk about this stuff. So,
if I have an experience, I live in Florida. We got the skunk ape around here. So if
Mm-hmm.
I have an experience with the skunk ape in Florida and it's compelling, I can contact you through your webpage or your website.
Yeah, and if people get onto my either through my website or if you get onto my my Facebook fan page, which I encourage people to click on and join and like my fan page if you want. My public email address is listed in there somewhere, so people can get in touch with me via email to my Facebook site as well. Okay.
Well, thanks again, Ken. I really appreciate it. And I am actually interested, future reference, in the Mothman as well. I know I'm from Ohio originally, but my father-in-law was from West Virginia. And actually that exact area, he was growing up as a child when that was going on. And it's always fascinated him as well. That was Point Pleasant, right? That's where I'm thinking of? Point Pleasant.
Mm-hmm.
So definitely would be interested in discussing Mothman with you at a later date as well. If we can put that together, that'd be great.
Yeah, absolutely. It'll be a completely different discussion for sure.
For sure, absolutely.
180.
Yeah, I just love open-minded people to have an open-minded conversations, and I thank you very much for joining us today, and hope we can talk to you again.
Sounds good. Let's do it again real soon.
Thanks you much, Pete. Sir. We'll talk to you later. Thanks.
Bye.
So that was Ken Gerhard. I believe I'm saying that correctly. And it is, I am thankful that, at least in terms of my last question, he did not say, yes, I agree, Bigfoot is an interdimensional alien being. You immediately lost me at that point. Your credibility's gone. I think that the idea of the Bigfoot is, it's romantic for sure. I mean, I definitely would like to believe that there is potentially something out there that we just haven't found yet. I mean, I can get behind that, quite honestly. I mean, there are plenty of, I'm sure there are tribes in the Amazon somewhere that we have not discovered yet. There are a lot of things in the world that we don't see, don't know, and we are so stuck in the virtual world anyway. We're not really even looking for those things anymore. I made the point earlier in the podcast. We found everything we want to find. We know everything there is to know. Why even continue to explore? We've kind of lost a little bit of what makes us human, that explorer instinct, unfortunately, because now everything's on your phone. Everything is right there at your fingertips. I can Google something immediately and have the answer I want. My kids nowadays don't understand what the library was for. Had that conversation with my daughter Lauren the other day, how when I was younger, I had to go to the library and actually look up books and do the research myself and then type it back on my typewriter. Boy, that I feel old. So, what are your thoughts? Have you ever had an experience with Bigfoot? Was it something that happened to you in your home that changed you, that you need to tell somebody about? Do you have some evidence? Do you have anything like that? You can contact us. Well, you can contact Ken on his webpage, the information he gave you already. You can also contact us on the Prove Me Wrong podcast. You can contact us on our Facebook page. It's just titled Prove Me Wrong. Look it up. It's there. Our Instagram is also Prove Me Wrong. You can email us at provemewrongcast@gmail.com. And if you're just looking for more content in terms of the podcast itself, you can like us and subscribe on Spotify, iTunes, the Apple Podcast Store, Apple Podcasts, Tunein Radio, Stitcher, anywhere really that you find podcasts, you can find the Prove Me Wrong podcast. Like it, subscribe to it, and it'll make sure that you are the first person to get them when they are released. We typically release them once a week. We may start going a little bit more than that. Also, we have a YouTube channel as well. Like and subscribe. If you like what you've heard today, subscribe to the channel and see the next interview that comes out. We're going to have a lot of these type of interviews with interesting people talking about interesting things. It's interesting to me. I don't know. I'm sure some of you out there would be interested as well. So before we sign off, I do want to say that this episode of the Prove Me Wrong podcast is brought to you by ZendoZones citronella burners from JT Eaton. They are shaped like fearless little tiki gods, so let Surf and Stan, Hawaiian Howie, and Luau Lily bring the islands to your backyard with ZendoZones citronella burners. They use natural 3% incense cones, 3% citronella candles and incense cones. They're perfect for patios, decks, backyards, campsites, poolside, and more. You can enjoy the outdoors again. They are available on Amazon and at Ace Hardware, and you can collect them today. So for my guest, Ken Gerhard, and the Prove Me Wrong podcast, once again, I'm Pete Lieb, and we hope to talk to you again soon.